A young American nurse stood in the center of a military compound, surrounded by armed guards. Her hands trembled as she faced her commanding officer. Behind her, 40 Japanese women watched in silence, their bodies ravaged by a disease that shouldn't exist. What happened in the next 60 seconds would either save their lives or destroy hers. This is the true story of courage that crossed enemy lines, and an act of honor so unexpected it changed everything. August 1945. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki had barely dissipated when the world exhaled. The war in the Pacific was over, but for First Lieutenant Evelyn Reed, the real battle was just beginning. She stood on the docks of Guam, watching the chaos unfold. The humid air stuck to her skin like a second uniform. Around her, thousands of Japanese prisoners of war shuffled off transport ships, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical. Women clutched children. Old men stumbled. Soldiers kept their heads down in shame. Guam had become a massive sorting center for humanity. The Americans had transformed this tropical island into a sprawling network of internment camps almost overnight. Barbed wire stretched for miles. Guard towers dotted the landscape like mechanical sentries. Evie had seen the horrors of field hospitals, had held dying men as they screamed for their mothers. But this felt different. The war was supposed to be over. She reported to Sector 4 the next morning. The camp held roughly 200 Japanese civilians, mostly women and children evacuated from Saipan and Tinian before those islands fell. They lived in hastily constructed barracks that leaked when it rained and baked like ovens under the Pacific sun. Captain Richard Wallace ran Sector 4 like he ran everything in his life, by the book. Every regulation memorized, every form filed in triplicate, every decision calculated to avoid trouble. He greeted Evie in his office, a small wooden structure that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Wallace was in his early 40s with thinning hair and eyes that never quite met yours. He wasn't cruel. He was worse. He was indifferent. "Lieutenant Reed," he said, not bothering to stand. "Your duties are straightforward. Daily health checks. Report any contagious diseases immediately. Treat minor injuries. Anything serious gets transferred to the main hospital. Questions?" Evie stood at attention. "Sir, what about nutritional assessments? I understand the prisoners are on limited rations." Wallace waved a hand dismissively. "They get what everyone gets. Rice, canned fish, water. It meets minimum caloric requirements per Geneva Convention standards. The war may be over, Lieutenant, but resources are still tight. We're not running a resort." "Sir, I wasn't suggesting—" "Good. Dismissed." That first week, Evie moved through the camp like a ghost. The Japanese women watched her with suspicion, their faces carefully blank. She didn't blame them. She wore the uniform of the nation that had firebombed their cities, that had killed their husbands and sons. Sergeant Mary Nakamura, a Japanese-American interpreter from Hawaii, helped bridge the language gap. Mary was in her late 20s, caught between two worlds. She spoke both languages fluently, but belonged fully to neither. "They're scared," Mary explained as they walked between the barracks. "Not just of being here. They're ashamed. In Japanese culture, being captured is deeply dishonorable. Many of these women wanted to die on Saipan rather than surrender." Evie nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "Tell them I'm here to help. Tell them I'm a nurse, not a soldier." Mary translated, but the women's expressions didn't change. Trust wasn't given. It was earned. By the second week, Evie noticed something wrong. Mrs. Yoshiko Sato, a woman in her early 30s with 2 young daughters, moved with increasing difficulty. Her legs seemed stiff, uncooperative. She winced when she walked. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. When Evie examined her through Mary's translation, Mrs. Sato complained of tingling in her feet, muscle weakness and exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Then came the rash. Painful, angry red patches on her legs and torso. Her mental state deteriorated. She became confused, forgetting simple things. One morning, Evie found her sitting on her bunk, unable to remember her daughters' names. The girls cried quietly, helpless. Evie recognized the symptoms immediately. Beriberi, a disease caused by severe thiamine deficiency. Vitamin B1. The polished white rice the prisoners received had been stripped of its nutrient-rich outer layers. Combined with the lack of fresh vegetables, meat, or fortified foods, Their diet was a medical disaster waiting to happen. Beriberi attacked the nervous system. Untreated, it caused permanent paralysis, heart failure, and death. Mrs. Sato wasn't the only one. Over the next 3 days, Evie identified 8 more women with early symptoms. Fatigue, numbness, confusion. The disease was spreading like wildfire through Sector 4. She burst into Captain Wallace's office without knocking. He looked up from his paperwork, annoyed. "Lieutenant Reed, ever heard of protocol?" "Sir, we have a medical emergency. I've confirmed 9 cases of beriberi among the female prisoners. Without treatment, they'll develop permanent nerve damage or die." Wallace set down his pen slowly. "Beriberi, that's a vitamin deficiency, correct?" "Yes, sir. Thiamine deficiency. It's caused by their diet. They need vitamin supplements immediately. And we need to add fresh vegetables, whole grains, meat." "Absolutely not." Wallace's voice was flat, final. Evie blinked. "Sir, I don't think you understand the severity." "I understand perfectly, Lieutenant. You're asking me to requisition special rations for enemy prisoners when our own men are still on field rations. You're asking me to divert medical supplies when we have wounded American soldiers who need them. The answer is no. These are civilians, sir. Women and children. They're Japanese," Wallace said, his voice hardening. "The same Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor, who tortured our POWs, who sent kamikazes to kill our boys. They get the minimum required by international law, nothing more. The minimum is killing them. Then they should have thought about that before their country started a war." Wallace stood, his face reddening. "You're dismissed, Lieutenant. And if I hear another word about special treatment for the enemy, I'll have you transferred to a supply depot in Alaska. Are we clear?" Evie's hands clenched into fists. "Crystal clear, sir." She left his office, shaking with rage. Mary found her behind the medical tent, pacing like a caged animal. "He said no?" Mary asked quietly. "He said no. What are you going to do?" Evie stopped pacing. She thought of Mrs. Sato, unable to walk without help. Of the other women, the disease creeping through their bodies like poison. Of her oath as a nurse. "First, do no harm. I'm going to save them," she said. With or without permission. Private James Torres worked in the main supply depot. He was 19, fresh-faced from El Paso, Texas. He owed Evie a favor. She'd covered for him when he'd gotten drunk on duty 2 months ago, keeping him out of the brig. Now it was time to collect. She found him during his lunch break, sitting behind a stack of crates. "Jimmy, I need your help." He looked up, sandwich halfway to his mouth. "Uh-oh. That's your serious voice. I need vitamin B supplements. Fresh vegetables if you can get them. Meat. Anything with nutritional value." Jimmy's eyes widened. "From the depot?" "Lieutenant, those supplies are accounted for. There's inventory checks, requisition forms." "I know. That's why I'm not going through official channels." "You're asking me to steal?" "I'm asking you to save lives." Jimmy set down his sandwich. He was quiet for a long moment. "This is for those Japanese women in Sector 4, isn't it? The sick ones." "Yes." "Captain Wallace know about this?" "Captain Wallace is the reason I'm here talking to you instead of going through proper channels." Jimmy rubbed his face. "Jesus, Lieutenant. You're asking me to risk a court-martial. I'm asking you to do the right thing. I'm asking you to be the kind of man who can live with himself after this war ends. Not the kind who followed orders. The kind who followed his conscience." He met her eyes. Saw the desperation there. The determination. He thought of his own mother back in El Paso. Her gentle hands, her fierce love. He thought of what he'd want someone to do if she were the one sick and forgotten in a camp somewhere. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, but we do this smart. Small amounts. Different items from different shipments. Nothing that'll trigger a red flag on inventory reports." Evie felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you." Over the next 2 weeks, they orchestrated a careful operation. Jimmy would miscount inventory. A box of vitamin supplements would be damaged in shipping. Fresh vegetables meant for the officers' mess would be accidentally delivered to the wrong location. Evie would smuggle everything into Sector 4 under her medical bag, distributed during her rounds. The women noticed immediately. The first time Evie handed Mrs. Sato a vitamin tablet and a fresh orange, the woman stared like she'd been given gold. Mary translated Evie's instructions. 1 tablet daily. Eat the whole orange, including the white part of the peel where nutrients concentrated. Mrs. Sato's hands shook as she accepted the orange. She brought it to her nose, inhaling deeply. Tears rolled down her face. She bowed deeply, words tumbling out in Japanese. "She says thank you," Mary translated, her own voice thick. "She says she didn't think Americans had mercy." Evie had to look away. "Tell her we're not all the same. Tell her she's someone's mother. That's all that matters to me." Word spread quietly through the barracks. The American nurse was helping them, bringing medicine, bringing real food. The women's attitude shifted. They stopped avoiding her eyes. Some began to smile. A few of the children started bringing her small gifts, folded paper cranes, drawings, smooth stones from the compound yard. The vitamins worked. Mrs. Sato's symptoms began to reverse. The tingling in her feet faded. Her mental clarity returned. She could walk without help, play with her daughters again. The other sick women improved too. It felt like a miracle, but it was just medicine. Simple, basic medicine that should have been given from the start. But good things in war never last. Captain Wallace noticed the improvement during a routine inspection. He wasn't stupid. The women looked healthier, stronger, too strong for people on starvation rations. He started asking questions, checking supply records, watching Evie's movements. It took him 10 days to figure it out. Evie was in the medical tent organizing supplies when Wallace stormed in with 2 MPs. His face was purple with rage. "You've been stealing medical supplies," he roared. "Diverting food rations. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Evie stood slowly, meeting his eyes. "I saved lives, sir. You broke military law. You defied direct orders. You compromised supply chain integrity. I kept women from dying of a preventable disease. They're the enemy. They're human beings." Evie's voice rose to match his. "They're mothers and daughters in someone's family, and I took an oath that doesn't have exceptions for nationality." Wallace stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're finished, Reed. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison time. I'm going to destroy you." "Then do it," Evie said quietly. "But those women are alive, and I'd make the same choice again." The MPs moved to arrest her. That's when everything changed. A commotion erupted outside. Voices shouting in Japanese. The sound of organized movement. Wallace spun toward the tent entrance just as the flap opened. Major Katsuro Tanaka stood in the entrance. The Japanese officer was in his 50s, his posture military perfect despite captivity. His uniform was worn but clean. His face was carved from stone, weathered by sun and battle. Behind him stood 20 Japanese soldiers from the men's sector, standing at attention. And behind them, the 40 women of Sector 4, including Mrs. Sato holding her daughter's hands. The camp had gone dead silent. Major Tanaka stepped forward. He moved with the dignity of a man who had surrendered his sword, but not his honor. In his hands, he carried something wrapped in cloth. He stopped 3 feet from Evie and Captain Wallace. Then, to everyone's shock, he bowed. Not a slight nod, but a full, deep bow of profound respect. He held it for a long moment before straightening. He spoke in clear, accented English. His voice carried across the compound. "I am Major Katsuro Tanaka, Imperial Japanese Army. I have fought against America for 4 years. I have lost men. I have killed men. I have seen the worst that war creates." He paused, his dark eyes moving to Evie. "But today, I have witnessed something I did not expect. I have witnessed true honor in the uniform of my enemy." Wallace stepped forward. "Major Tanaka, you're out of bounds. Return to your sector immediately or—" Tanaka ignored him completely. He continued addressing Evie, his voice ringing with authority that captivity couldn't diminish. "In my culture, there is a concept. Giri. It means duty, obligation, the debt that must be repaid. Lieutenant Reed has shown mercy to our women when she had no reason to do so. She has risked her career, her freedom, perhaps her life. For us. For people her country calls enemy." He unwrapped the cloth in his hands. Inside was a small knife in an ornate sheath, his personal tanto, a blade that had been in his family for generations. "In recognition of her courage, her honor, and her humanity, I offer this. It is all I have of value." He held it out to Evie. She stared, unable to move. "I cannot accept—" she began. "You must," Tanaka interrupted, "because what you have done is seen by my soldiers. by these women, by your own men. You have proven that honor exists beyond flags and nations. You have proven that Bushido, the way of the warrior, is not exclusive to Japan. You, Lieutenant Reed, have embodied what we claim to value. You are samurai, whether you know it or not. Evie's hands trembled as she accepted the blade. It was surprisingly light, perfectly balanced. The sheath was worn smooth by generations of hands. Then Major Tanaka did something that made hardened soldiers gasp. He turned to face Captain Wallace, came to attention, and spoke in a voice that carried absolute authority despite his prisoner status. Captain Wallace, I am your prisoner. I have no rights, no power, no leverage, but I have eyes. I have seen Lieutenant Reed saving lives while you condemned women to death through neglect. I have seen her risk everything while you risked nothing. And I tell you now, before these witnesses, American and Japanese, history will remember her courage and your cowardice. Your name will be dust, hers will be legend. The silence that followed was deafening. Wallace's face went through several colors, red to white to purple again. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. An MP shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Sato stepped forward from the crowd of women. She was crying. She said something in Japanese, her voice breaking. Mary Nakamura translated, tears streaming down her own face. She says Lieutenant Reed gave her back her life, gave her back her daughters. She says the lieutenant is proof that kindness can survive war, that not all enemies have to remain enemies forever. One by one, the other women began to bow, deep, formal bows of gratitude and respect. The Japanese soldiers followed. Even the American guards looked uncertain, moved by something they didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. Captain Wallace was trapped. Dozens of witnesses, a public declaration of American mercy from an enemy officer. If he arrested Evie now, it would become a scandal. The story would spread. Reporters would get hold of it. The Army's public image, already complicated by stories of Japanese internment camps back in the States, couldn't afford another black eye. He was beaten, and he knew it. Dismissed, he said through clenched teeth. Everyone, now. The crowd dispersed slowly. Major Tanaka gave Evie one final nod before turning to leave. Wallace grabbed Evie's arm as she moved to follow. This isn't over, he hissed. Yes, she said quietly. It is. But she was wrong. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The story spread like wildfire through the military network. Soldiers talked, nurses talked. Someone wrote a letter home that mentioned it. A war correspondent getting drunk in the officers' club heard a version and started digging. Within 3 weeks, a small article appeared in the Pacific Stars and Stripes newspaper. Army nurse defies orders to save former enemy women. It was only 2 paragraphs, buried on page 6. But it was enough. The article reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. MacArthur, always conscious of America's image in occupied Japan, saw an opportunity. Here was a story of American compassion, of values transcending war, of mercy shown to the defeated. He ordered an investigation. The investigation cleared Evie of wrongdoing. More than that, it exposed the systemic nutritional deficiencies in the internment camps. New regulations were drafted, diets were improved, vitamin supplements became standard, medical oversight was increased. Captain Wallace was quietly transferred to a desk job in Manila, his career effectively over. Evie was promoted to captain and awarded a commendation for exemplary medical service and humanitarian action beyond the call of duty. She accepted it in a simple ceremony, Private Jimmy Torres standing proudly beside her. But the real award came later, much later. In 1948, 3 years after the war ended, Evie received a letter. It was postmarked from Nagasaki, written in careful English. Mrs. Yoshiko Sato had tracked her down through military records and Japanese-American aid organizations. The letter was 4 pages long. It described Mrs. Sato's journey home to Japan, the destruction she found, the slow rebuilding of her life. It described her daughters growing up, learning about the war, asking questions about the American nurse who had saved their mother's life. And it ended with an invitation. If Evie ever came to Japan, she would have a home, a family, a place where she belonged. Evie cried reading it. Mary Nakamura, who had stayed in touch, helped her write a reply. They corresponded for years. their letters bridging an ocean and a war. In 1955, Evie finally made the trip. She met Mrs. Sato's daughters, now young women. She met survivors from Sector 4 who remembered her. And she met Major Tanaka, retired, and running a small dojo in Kyoto, teaching young men about honor and Bushido. They sat together in his garden, drinking tea. The tanto blade she'd given back to him years ago sat between them on the table. He'd refused to take it back initially, but she'd insisted. It belonged to his family, to his history. "You changed more than you know, Lieutenant," Tanaka said. His English had improved over the years. "Those women, they told their families about you. Their families told others. In Japan, we heard that not all Americans were monsters, that some showed mercy. It helped after the war. It helped us accept the occupation, accept the rebuilding. One nurse cannot end a war, but one nurse can plant a seed of reconciliation." Evie looked at the blade, its surface catching the afternoon light. "I just did what any nurse would do." "No," Tanaka said firmly. "You did what most people hope they would do, but few actually manage. You saw human beings when others saw only enemies. That is rare. That is precious. That is why I tell your story to my students. Why Mrs. Sato tells your story to her daughters. Why you must tell it to whoever will listen." "Why?" Evie asked. "It was so long ago." "Because," Tanaka said, picking up the blade and holding it carefully, "the next war is always coming. Different uniforms, different flags, different reasons, but always the same choice. Will you see the human being or will you see only the enemy? Your story reminds people that the choice exists. That even in the darkest times, even when orders say otherwise, even when everyone around you says you're wrong, you can choose mercy. You can choose humanity." He set the blade down again. "That is why your story matters, Lieutenant Reed. Not because you were special, but because you were ordinary. You were just a nurse doing her job. And if an ordinary person can do extraordinary things, then maybe we all can. Maybe we all must." Evie stayed in Japan for 3 weeks. She visited Hiroshima and wept at what she saw. She visited schools where children who had been born after the war asked her questions about peace and reconciliation. She attended a ceremony where survivors of Sector 4 presented her with a hand-painted scroll, calligraphy spelling out words Mary translated. "The bridge between former enemies is built one act of kindness at a time." When she returned to America, she began speaking. Not to big audiences, not at first. Just small groups. Veterans organizations, nursing schools, churches. She told her story simply, without drama. What she'd seen, what she'd done, why she'd done it, the choice she'd faced, and the choice she'd made. Some audiences loved her. Some were angry, saying she'd betrayed American soldiers by helping the enemy. She listened to both. She understood both. War made people tribal, made them draw hard lines between us and them. She'd learned that the lines were real, but they weren't permanent. They could be crossed. They could be erased. Private Jimmy Torres became Sergeant Torres, then Lieutenant Torres. He spent 20 years in the Army, and he told the story too. Every young soldier under his command heard it. The time he and a nurse stole supplies to save enemy lives. The time they chose what was right over what was ordered. Some of them carried that story to Vietnam, some to Korea, some to conflicts Evie would never live to see. Mary Nakamura became a teacher in Hawaii, bridging cultures, teaching Japanese-American children about their heritage and all children about reconciliation. She made the story part of her curriculum. Her students wrote essays about it. Some of those students became teachers themselves, passing it forward. Captain Wallace died in 1968, bitter and alone. His obituary listed his service record, but mentioned no special achievements. No one came to his funeral except his sister and a handful of obligatory military representatives. He'd lived by the rules and died forgotten. History, as Major Tanaka had predicted, had no use for him. Major Tanaka died in 1984, surrounded by 3 generations of family and dozens of former students. At his funeral, his granddaughter read from a worn journal he'd kept. The entry from that day in Guam, August 1945, when he'd witnessed an enemy soldier choose mercy over orders. "Today I saw proof," he'd written, "that honor is not bound by nationality, that Bushido exists in all cultures, waiting to be awakened." The American nurse has shown me that our values are not uniquely Japanese but universally human. This gives me hope for peace. Evie lived to be 89 years old. She died in 1997 in a hospital in San Francisco, surrounded by children and grandchildren. She'd never married, but her life had been full. At her bedside was an old photograph. Sector 4, Guam, 1945. 40 Japanese women standing with one American nurse, their faces reflecting shared humanity across the ashes of war. Her last words, whispered to her niece, were simple. "I just did my job, but I'm glad I did it right." The story didn't die with her. It couldn't. Too many people carried it. Too many children had been told about the nurse and the captain and the enemy commander who became allies in the pursuit of something higher than victory. The story lived in textbooks and documentaries, in essays written by high school students, in quiet conversations between veterans who'd learned that the enemy was never as simple as the propaganda posters suggested. Because in the end, Evelyn Reed's story wasn't really about one nurse or 40 women or a standoff in a prison camp. It was about the choice that defines us. The choice between following the easy path of orders and regulations or following the hard path of conscience and humanity. It was about seeing the person beyond the uniform, the mother beyond the enemy, the shared suffering that connects us all. Major Tanaka had been right. The next war was always coming, but so was the next Evelyn Reed, the next person who would face that impossible choice and choose mercy, the next ordinary person who would do something extraordinary, not because they were special, but because they refused to let circumstance make them cruel. That's what the story teaches. Not that war can be kind, not that enemies become friends overnight, but that even in the darkest places, even when systems and orders push us toward inhumanity, we always have a choice. We can choose to see. We can choose to care. We can choose to risk something precious, career, safety, approval, for the sake of someone else's life. And sometimes, just sometimes, that choice echoes across decades. It ripples outward like a stone thrown into still water, touching shores we'll never see, changing hearts we'll never know, building bridges we'll never cross but that future generations will walk across freely. That's the legacy of First Lieutenant Evelyn Reed. Not medals or promotions, though she earned those. Not articles or textbooks, though she's in those too. Her real legacy is simpler and more profound. She proved that one person can matter, that one choice can ripple, that ordinary courage can become extraordinary change. And she proved that even when the world tells you to look away, to follow orders, to prioritize your tribe over their tribe, you can choose differently. You can choose to be human first and a soldier second. You can choose mercy without betraying duty. You can choose to save lives even when those lives wear the wrong uniform. That's the story of how 40 Japanese women survived, how one American nurse risked everything, and how one enemy commander recognized honor when he saw it, regardless of the flag it served. It's a story about war, but it's really a story about peace. About the peace we build one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of seeing each other clearly at a time. And it's a story that needs telling now more than ever, because the uniforms change and the flags change and the reasons change. But the choice? The choice never changes. It's always there, waiting. Waiting for the next ordinary person to do something extraordinary. Waiting for the next Evelyn Reed to choose humanity over hatred, mercy over malice, life over death. The question isn't whether that person will come. They always come, in every generation, in every conflict, in every dark hour. The question is whether we'll recognize them, whether we'll support them, whether we'll tell their stories and honor their choices and learn from their courage. Because in the end, that's how the world changes. Not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through quiet acts of defiance against cruelty, through nurses stealing supplies to save lives, through privates helping them, through enemy commanders recognizing honor in unexpected places, through mothers surviving to raise daughters, through daughters telling their children, through stories that refuse to die. The story of Evelyn Reed and the 40 women of Sector 4 is one of those stories. It happened in the shadow of the atomic bomb, in the wreckage of the deadliest war in human history, in a forgotten corner of a forgotten island. But it happened. It was real. And it matters. Not because it was unique, but because it was repeatable. Because anyone could be Evelyn Reed. Anyone could make that choice. Anyone could plant that seed of reconciliation. All it takes is the courage to see clearly, to look past the uniform to the person, to look past the propaganda to the parent, to look past the enemy to the human being who bleeds and hurts and loves and fears just like you do. That's the message. That's the lesson. That's why we tell this story 78 years later, when everyone involved has turned to dust but the choice remains as fresh and urgent as ever. Choose to see, choose to care, choose mercy, choose humanity. The world you save might be your own. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we all face and the kind of people we want to be, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Give this video a like so more people can discover these forgotten stories of courage and humanity. Because these stories matter, these choices matter. And the more we remember them, the more likely we are to make them ourselves when our moment comes. Thanks for watching.